Okay, finger pulls. Something that I didn't figure that. I'd been making pots for like 15 years before I figured this out. This is the way a finger pull should start. Rib pull should start this way too, but we're talking specifically about a finger pull now. Unless you're making a bowl or something that's going to open outward. Either way, it starts with a good strong squeeze. Your hand should not start to move until the clay has started to grow. At that point you've started the wave that you're trying to follow. Then, unless you're throwing a bowl or something that opens outward, your outside hand needs to move first until it develops a position relative to the inside hand, point of contact, that is just a little bit higher than the inside hand. This is instrumental to building a strong wall that comes inward as you want it to with the beginning of making a pot. So it starts with a squeeze, doesn't progress from there until the clay starts to grow. Then the outside hand moves first until it gets the position it needs over the inside hand. Then they move together. And of course, the amount of squeeze you're applying diminishes as you get closer to the top. With a rib pull, you want to treat the rib as if it's some kind of form board. This would be an expanding pull, that you're pushing the clay out and packing against. And then you are climbing up the rib. The rib doesn't move until you get to what would correspond to like the sweet spot on a baseball bat or a tennis racket. Exactly where you want to be applying pressure. If you watch the videos and see that this is what I do. That's an expanding pull. If you don't see the clay getting flat against the rib as you're climbing it, you're not pushing it hard enough into the rib. That's different from if you're using a finger inside and out. The constricting pull, you watch how it starts. Starts by pushing in, then the rib rotates to get underneath this bulge that you're then going to drive to the top of the pot. And at the very end, when you get to the very end, you have to kind of change it a little bit. You can't push that bulge all the way out the top. You kind of got to rotate your rib back and just kind of drive it inward like that. In each case, you're creating a wave and pushing it from the bottom of the pot to the top of the pot. And there are ways that you could compare it to pushing a wrinkle out of a rug on a floor. There is a wrinkle and you start at one point and you just push that wrinkle until it comes out the other end. In an expanding rib pull, you can think of the rib as the floor, the wave being the wrinkle. And in a constricting pull, it's a little different. What you're actually pushing against with a constricting pull is the resistance of the clay to being constricted. You can actually do a constricting pull without your hand on the inside. I've demonstrated that plenty of times. You're better off having it in there, and it may be putting some pressure to help maintain the bulge underneath the rib, but it's not pushing against the rib. The rib is pushing that bulge through. Up to now, this video has focused entirely on getting through the first two exercises. And as you proceed, you'll realize how important that is. You'll realize how easy it is to learn to do the three remaining exercises. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about them. Collaring comes after the cylinder. Don't even bother until you've learned to throw a good cylinder. Learn to throw the good cylinder. To try to collar the top of a bad cylinder is just asking for trouble. Collaring, what you really learn there for one thing, your hands may realize that collaring is only a slightly different application of a constricting pull. In collaring, it's really obvious that what you're pushing against is the resistance of the clay to being constricted. You learn the concept of building a dome, which, as I say in the video, is basically the self-supporting shape that is going to stand up to the stresses that you're exerting on the clay. And you learn the fundamentals of a good dome. Keeping it dry is important. Flexible metal ribs are perfect for that. Maintaining a nice smooth dome line, no valleys, no points, nothing like that in the transition from the dome to the neck. You also have to develop your sensitivity to irregularities in the clay. In the same way that irregularities in the clay in pulling a wall will result in the lip coming up uneven or unevenly. When you take that wall and constrict it to the narrow diameter of a neck, boy, that just magnifies the effect of any irregularities. That's why you're trying to get that entirely worked out. And it can be done. Not entirely to the point of, well, theoretically entirely to the point of being perfect. Perfect, as I say in the videos, is not something that exists in the real world. But let's say functionally perfect as the goal. Perfect enough for your needs. That's the extent of what you're going to learn from collaring, and it's easy enough that if you really pay attention, and this is going to vary from person to person, you should be able to master it in a day. And collaring is a good example to start with of something that has to be said. Of all these things I'm telling you about, like, do it this way. This is what you want it to look like. This is how you want to do it. If we think of these as the rules that I'm giving you, it's important to understand that I haven't analyzed every single rule, but I don't know if there's a single one that can't be bent or broken when you get to be good at it, when your hands start to understand it and have some acquired knowledge of what's happening. The rules are excellent to follow in learning to do it. Collaring is one where, boy, you can take an awful lot of shortcuts. Once you get good at it, you can really start winging it. As long as you know not to, as long as you understand it well enough to know what you can get away with and what you can't. Moving on to the satellite dish bowl, that's another one where, you know, once you get good at it, you can really start taking liberties with the rules. It's even more fun when you do. But this is a good way to learn to do it. And one thing I can add about that is if you have ever seen in person or in a video someone demonstrating making a bowl by throwing a slightly flaring cylinder wall and then taking a big rib or stick or something and just bending that wall over, what's at play there is a characteristic of the clay that is incredibly important, and that's the biggest that's the biggest thing you're going to learn from the satellite dish bowl. The other thing that you will get out of the satellite dish bowl exercise is learning that there are times, especially with a swollen form or a bowl, that, especially with a bowl, that you need to deal with the clay at the bottom of the wall. Not in any way like a pull, but where you're trying to apply pressure to it in such a way that you're taking a specific mass of clay and causing it to move, to reform into a different shape. There's nothing going on here that resembles a pull. It does have the element of enclosure and compression, but that's an important thing to learn. Not as important as what you as the biggest thing you get from the satellite dish bowl is learning what it feels like when you take a well-built wall and stretch it. This is something you actually can do this to a very limited extent if you want to with a cylinder, but not like this. When you take a well-structured wall and stretch it, it's like it brings the clay to a level of organization that is just astonishing, and you can feel it. And again, this is going to vary from student to student depending on the natural sensitivity you have in your hands. Either way, if you have hands, you can learn to feel it. As I said, the sensitivity in your hands to what's going on in the clay develops through use, like any other sense. Now, that's probably all there is to say about the satellite dish bowl. It's really fun to do. That brings us to the final exercise, the swollen form with the collared top. And as I say in the introduction to the first exercise, well, I wasn't real happy with the cross-section of the collared part of that pot when I cut it in half. I was getting a little irritated with the amount of time I was putting into this stuff at the time, and it was still adequate for demonstration. The swollen form, this is where, for the lower part of the form, up to the widest point of the form, you are simply taking the expanding rib pull that you have learned in throwing a cylinder and tweaking it a little bit. And I described that in the video, how you should be doing it. And then incorporating the stretching that you learned in the satellite dish bowl, the dome and closing in the top that you learned in collaring. It's like there's nothing new to learn there, and yet this is a very sophisticated pot. This is just a very cool pot to be able to throw with the lightness that is actually inherent in doing it right. There really is only one other thing I want to mention, I guess, and that is that probably posted at the same time as this video will be a video on clay reprocessing. And that will be describing and illustrating what I consider to be a good approach to reprocessing your clay. And from there progress to what we'll call it clay prep instruction. That's going to basically cover wedging, kneading, that kind of stuff. So that's it. I hope this information ends up being of value to anybody.